The young and the restless spoilers. Everything in Genoa City was unraveling faster than anyone could comprehend, a whirlwind of chaos tightening its grip on every corner of their lives. What had once been a community held together by fragile alliances, whispered promises, and the illusion of stability had now begun to crumble under the weight of betrayal, suspicion, and emotional fatigue. There was an unmistakable heaviness in the air. An atmosphere of exhaustion that no amount of sunlight or corporate spin could cleanse. The city's most powerful families were stretched thin, caught between boardroom wars and personal implosions, and while the people of Genoa braced themselves against the storm, it was across the Atlantic, in the heart of Paris, where a far more sinister tragedy had begun to unfold, one that would change the trajectory of lives forever and expose a darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The headlines broke in the early hours of the morning, sending shockwaves through the elite circles of Genoa and far beyond. Amy Cain, successful, enigmatic, and deeply intertwined in both romance and mystery, had been found dead in his rented Parisian apartment. The news itself was unbelievable, not just for its brutality but for what it represented, the total derailment of any sense of normalcy for Lily Winters, the woman who had loved him. Damian's lifeless body was discovered in the early hours by a building concierge responding to tenant complaints of a door left ajar and a strange metallic smell wafting through the corridor. What awaited behind that door was a scene so graphic, so meticulously horrific, that even seasoned officers from the Paris police were left visibly shaken. Damian lay sprawled across the polished floor, his chest and abdomen bearing the unmistakable signs of multiple stab wounds, each one executed with disturbing precision. A bloodied knife rested mere inches from his outstretched hand, as though inviting anyone, to believe it had been suicide, or perhaps a crime of passion gone wrong. But to Chance Chancellor, the image painted a very different story, one that chilled him to the bone the moment he laid eyes on the official case photos. Chance, now serving as a consultant for international law enforcement and acting as Genoa City's quiet connection to overseas investigations, had seen many crime scenes in his life. But what he saw in the photographic evidence of Damian's death didn't feel like chaos. It felt like choreography. Nothing was out of place. The knife was positioned too perfectly, the splatter too narrowly confined, the blood trails too linear, and the absence of defensive wounds on Damian's hands suggested that he either never saw it coming, or worse, he knew it was coming and didn't resist. But even that felt too clean. Every fiber in Chance's instincts screamed that this wasn't just a murder, it was a performance. A staged execution meant to fool, to manipulate, to mislead. Whoever did this wanted the authorities to believe the simplest version of the story, a man dead from a violent encounter, clues scattered conveniently, evidence practically gift-wrapped. But real crime didn't work that way. Real killers didn't leave a buffet of fingerprints, strands of hair, and samples of blood unless they wanted someone to believe the wrong story. And Chance knew, perhaps better than anyone, that this killer wanted someone to be blamed. Someone specific. And Lily, with her recent emotional volatility and her visible relationship with Damian, would make an ideal target if this went unchecked. The Parisian authorities, competent but bound by traditional investigative procedures, were treating the case with the urgency one would expect for a high-profile international death. Forensics teams moved through the apartment like a machine, dusting for prints, collecting samples, and cataloging every single item that could possibly hold evidentiary value. The early reports indicated there were at least 5 different sets of fingerprints, one matching Damian's, 2 belonging to known building personnel, and the remaining 2 still unidentified. Strands of long dark hair were recovered from the bathroom sink, and smudged footprints, bare, faint, and only visible through specialized infrared scanning, were found leading from the front entrance into the kitchen, then halting inexplicably by the fireplace. Most disturbingly, however, were the blood patterns on the floor and walls, perfectly aligned, mathematically consistent, and all too convenient. This wasn't just murder. This was a message, and if no one else could see that, Chance feared they were walking straight into the trap its architect had so painstakingly laid. Meanwhile, Lily's world was collapsing. News of Damian's death reached her not through official channels, but from a phone call made by a journalist in Paris who had caught wind of the case and wanted a quote for publication. That moment, the words, the tone, they broke her. Lily had already been struggling with questions about Damian's past, the long shadows he seemed to carry with him, and the strange inconsistencies in his behavior that she had dismissed in the name of love. Now, faced with the finality of his death and the gruesome way it had occurred, her heart could no longer separate grief from guilt. She wondered if there had been signs, clues to this unraveling, that she had ignored. Or worse, she wondered if her own entanglements had somehow placed Damian in the crosshairs of someone dangerous, someone who was using her as leverage, as bait, or perhaps as scapegoat. Back in Genoa City, whispers were already forming in boardrooms and behind closed doors. Some questioned Damian's motives for being in Paris in the first place. Others speculated that his relationship with Lily had opened doors for him, access to Chancellor Winters, to sensitive information, and to people with long, unforgiving memories. It didn't take long before accusations began to circulate, not officially, but through the toxic web of gossip that Genoa's elite had perfected. Some even hinted that Lily had motive, that perhaps Damian had been manipulating her, and when she discovered the truth, something snapped. It was baseless, offensive, and entirely lacking in substance, but in the absence of facts, fiction often rises to take their place. Chance couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. He reached out to the lead investigator in Paris, offering his services not as an outsider, but as someone with direct insight into the circles Damian moved through, the people he spoke with, and the connections he may have been leveraging. His offer was met with polite dismissal, standard protocol, they said. The case was progressing. There was no need for external interference. But Chance wasn't convinced, and he wasn't deterred. He began his own shadow investigation, quietly pulling surveillance data from the building, reviewing Damian's known contacts in Paris, and following the money trail, because in cases like these, the truth was rarely hidden in sentiment. It was hidden in transactions, in flight logs, in phone calls at odd hours and deleted messages recovered from the cloud. And that's when he found the first real crack in the case. Damian's phone, recovered at the scene, had a messaging app installed that wasn't widely used, an encrypted platform favored by financial criminals and espionage operatives. One message, sent just 12 hours before his death, simply read, "She knows." It was unsigned, untraceable, but the timestamp didn't lie. Someone had warned Damian. Or perhaps they had threatened him. But who was she? Was it Lily? Was it someone else entirely? And more importantly, what was it she knew that warranted such a violent, theatrical death? The deeper Chance dug, the clearer it became that Damian had stumbled into something far bigger than a love affair gone wrong. He had been meeting with individuals tied to shell corporations, some with connections to private intelligence firms, others with ties to organized crime syndicates operating in both Paris and Geneva. A few of the companies shared silent stakeholders with firms that had once attempted hostile acquisitions of Chancellor Winters. The coincidence was too sharp. Damian hadn't just been in love, he had been playing with fire. And now he was ashes on a cold Parisian floor, while the people who lit the match remained hidden in shadow, waiting for someone to take the fall. As the days passed, and the media frenzy began to taper into something more clinical and distant, Lily remained frozen in a state of heartbreak mixed with fear. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She replayed every conversation with Damian, every late-night whisper, every time he looked at her as if trying to confess something but never finding the courage. She wondered if he had wanted to tell her everything. Or if he had tried to protect her by keeping her in the dark. Now, those answers were buried with him, and all she had left were questions, accusations, and the slowly building threat of becoming the next victim of a narrative she didn't even understand. But what no one in Paris, or Genoa City, yet realized was that this was just the beginning. The murder of Amy Cain wasn't an end. It was a signal. Someone had declared war in a language written in blood and silence, and the battlefield had already expanded beyond city limits and corporate lines. As Chance uncovered more pieces, he began to sense it wasn't just Damian who was in danger before. Now, everyone who had ever stood too close to him, including Lily, might be next. And somewhere out there, in the shadowed alleys of Paris or the glittering high-rises of Genoa City, someone was watching. Waiting. Planning their next move. Because once a trap is sprung, the real game begins. And this one was far from over. Let me know if you want a continuation, a parallel storyline, or a character's inner monologue expansion from this plot. I'm ready. Thank you for the additional plot developments. I will now continue and expand the narrative based on the following points. Damian's death has plunged everyone into deeper emotional and political chaos. Chance is desperate to intervene, but is denied access due to lack of jurisdiction and training. Lily is devastated and believes Cain is behind it all. Directly or indirectly through his subordinates, Amy, Damian's mother, travels to Paris to claim his body but eventually dies herself, overwhelmed by grief and cancer. The following is the next portion of the narrative, written in long, uninterrupted paragraphs, maintaining emotional depth and logical consistency, and contributing toward a total narrative exceeding 10,000 characters. Damian's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a detonation that fractured the already unstable foundations of every life it touched. In the immediate aftermath, the complexity of the case deepened, and with it came a suffocating sense of helplessness. Chancellor, who had always prided himself on being the man who stepped in when others faltered, found himself shackled not by fear or inexperience, but by the limitations of international law and the cold, procedural barriers set by the Parisian authorities. Despite his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary homicide, despite his connections and his unwavering determination, he was denied any formal access to the investigation. The reasoning was cruel in its simplicity. Chance lacked the qualifications to operate in a foreign jurisdiction and had no standing in the French legal system. And so he was forced to watch from the margins, gnawing on the edges of a puzzle that no one wanted him to solve, aware that the clock was ticking and the real killer might already be halfway across the world. The rejection stung not because of pride, but because deep inside, Chance knew the case was slipping through bureaucratic fingers. What he saw as orchestrated precision and calculated deception, the French investigators saw as open and shut. To them, the presence of fingerprints, blood, and strands of hair painted a simple picture, one of emotional rage, of betrayal turned lethal. It was a narrative easy to digest, and even easier to close. But Chance refused to believe that the truth could be so neat. He had seen too much, been fooled too many times, to buy into a solution that arrived too quickly. Still, with his hands tied, all he could do was compile what he could from afar. Tracking connections, whispering into ears back in Genoa City, and trying to unravel the thread Lily had already begun to pull. Lily, consumed by grief, found no peace in silence. The image of Damian's final moments haunted her waking hours and stalked her dreams. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been manipulated, that the final act of Damian's life had been scripted by someone else, a shadow pulling strings in the dark. And in her heart, one name kept resurfacing, Cain. It wasn't just suspicion. It was a gut-deep conviction. She had lived too long in Cain's world to dismiss the reach of his influence or the subtle way he operated through proxies, through whispers, through fear. Lily didn't believe Cain held the knife, but she was certain the hand that did was acting on his behalf. Perhaps a loyal subordinate. Perhaps someone paid off. But in the end, the trail led back to him, to the man who had always played the long game and never cared how many lives he shattered along the way. And so, standing in the ruins of her love for Damian, Lily made a decision that no longer relied on hope or justice, it relied only on survival. She told herself to be strong, to stay still even as the storm raged around her, and above all else, to never underestimate Cain again. Across the ocean, another heart was breaking. Quieter, but no less deeply. Amy, Damian's mother, received the call with the quiet stoicism of someone who had been dreading it for years. She had always known that her son lived in a world far more dangerous than he would ever admit, walking on a tightrope stretched between ambition and darkness. But knowing it didn't make it easier. The moment she heard the words "we regret to inform you," she didn't cry. She simply packed her things, boarded the next flight to Paris, and walked into the morgue as though walking into a dream. There, surrounded by sterile white walls and fluorescent lighting, she identified the body of her only child and fell to her knees, not because she doubted, but because she had never truly prepared herself for the finality of it. Damian, beautiful and broken, lay still beneath the sheet. And for Amy, something inside her shattered beyond repair. But Amy's journey wasn't only one of grief. It was the culmination of years of suppressed fear and the slow, invisible decay of her own body. For months she had been quietly battling an aggressive form of cancer, refusing to tell her son because she didn't want to become a burden. She had hidden the pain, the doctor's appointments, and the brutal side effects of her treatments behind carefully constructed smiles and measured words. But now, with nothing left to fight for, her body began to fail her completely. Her arrival in Paris marked not just the end of her son's life, but the beginning of her own final descent. She collapsed 2 days after claiming Damian's body, admitted to a hospital with complications. Doctors worked tirelessly, but there was little they could do. The cancer had spread too far, and the emotional trauma of losing Damian had accelerated her decline. In her final hours, she spoke little, only asking for one thing: to be buried near her son. And then, as quietly as she had arrived, Amy slipped away, leaving the world with nothing but unanswered questions and the echo of a mother's final sorrow. The deaths of Damian and Amy sent ripples through every circle they had touched. For some, it was an opportunity to shift blame, to rewrite history. For others, it was a wake-up call. And for a few, like Lily and Chance, it was a line in the sand. The stakes had changed. This was no longer about a single murder, or even a single suspect. This was about control, about eliminating threats, about silencing the voices that knew too much. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Cain, untouched, unbothered, and still pulling strings in shadows so deep no one could trace them. But his time would come. Because grief, when sharpened by justice and lit by vengeance, became something far more dangerous than hate. It became clarity. And in that clarity, Lily and Chance would find purpose again. Let me know when you're ready for the next part, involving Cain's secret network, the potential betrayal from within, or a shocking twist at Amy's funeral. I'm ready to keep the story going.